Apologies for the delay in getting it underway. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners from all the lands in which we're living and working on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander folks that are on the webinar today. My name's Charlie Wilbridge and I'm the Mind Out Project Officer and hosting this webinar today in the absence of Sally. Today's webinar is Affirmative Practice and LGBTIQ populations with Chris Pye from Relationships Australia in Queensland. Before I hand over to you, Chris, just ask everyone to mute their mics, and you don't necessarily have to have your cameras on if you don't want, but we will use the chat option at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions, and we can answer them either throughout or at the end, Chris, whichever you feel comfortable with.
That sounds great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to hand over to Chris now and I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you. And Charlie, before you go, just to say that I can at the moment see my presentation, which is awesome, and I can see the names of people on the right, but I can't see a chat option. So if I don't have vision of that, I might just invite you, if you don't mind, to bring anything to my attention if there are questions or bits and pieces that we need to address as we go through.
Sure. I'll work on that.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. And I see, just scrolling down, a few familiar names of people who I know, but haven't seen for quite a long time. So lovely to see you all again, and lovely to meet those of you who I haven't met before. My name is Chris Pye, and I'm the Manager of Diversity and Inclusion at Relationships Australia Queensland up here in Brisbane. It's a portfolio which is only 2 years old. So it's a fairly new piece of work, and my work in these first 2 years is really identifying parameters and aims, objectives and KPIs, and what we really want to do in this space when we talk about inclusive access and inclusion. And I'll talk a bit about what that is in a moment. I will say before we start that some of the material or content that we'll cover today may be a bit confronting emotionally, and so I just invite you to be aware of that, and if you need to clock out at any time because it feels a bit too challenging, then please just do your own self-care and take care of yourselves, and just be wary of anyone that you might want to kind of connect with after this to debrief anything that comes up. Okay. All right, so let me just give a bit of background to Relationships Australia Queensland. We were the Marriage Guidance Council until 1994, so we began life about 60 years ago. We're a not-for-profit non-government organisation. We receive state funding and federal funding. We have no religious affiliations. We have a staff of about 400 people, and they're spread across largely coastal areas of Queensland, from Thursday Island in the Torres Strait at the very far north down to the Gold Coast, and as far west as Longreach and Toowoomba, a bit nearer to the coast. So we have about 21 venues across the state. So these are some of the services that we include. So family dispute resolution, family and relationship counselling, domestic and family violence programs, gambling help service, victims counselling and support service, and children's contact services for separated couples. And there are always new contracts and new pieces of work that we're exploring and negotiating. But that's kind of the core stuff that we do. So just to talk to you briefly about the access and inclusion space that I head. This infographic shares the three, I suppose, target cohorts that we see represented underneath our portfolio of access and inclusion. So when we look at the top left, We've got the 4 target diverse communities that by their very identity experience marginalisation and historical discrimination. So we talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural and linguistic diversity, LGBTIQ+, or people of diverse bodies, genders and sexualities, and people with disability. And I work with internal stakeholders in the organisation to develop the work around supporting those particular communities. In the top right, it's that acknowledgement of our focus across the lifespan. So understanding that children and older people in particular can often be left out or experience particular obstacles in accessing and feeling included in services like ours. So those groups need to be on our radar as well. And then finally, it's socioeconomic disadvantage and mental illness, those areas that can be persistent or can be transient, people can move in and out of, but become often barriers to people accessing support and services. So those are the 3 areas that sit underneath my portfolio of access and inclusion. When we talk about our LGBTIQ work, we've been in that space delivering LGBTIQ plus supports and services since launching our Rainbow program in 2008, when we developed an LGBTIQ plus counselling service in collaboration with the Queensland AIDS Council, first based at their offices in Newstead in Brisbane, and then moving up to our Spring Hill central venue near Fortitude Valley. Within the Rainbow program, we have a specific Rainbow counselling service that's supported by counsellors with lived experience. We have cultural awareness training, LGBTIQ plus cultural awareness training, delivered to all our staff at induction phase. We have a Rainbow Rep network of staff who take on an additional portfolio to support and advocate for the mental health and well-being of LGBTIQ plus communities. And then we have our social emotional support groups, Transcendence for trans and gender diverse adults and Transilience for trans and gender diverse children. So that's a bit about the actual work that we do specifically in the space of LGBTIQ plus. So when I began the research in order to build learning and development frameworks for developing cultural fitness in this area in our organisation, there were a few learnings which were particularly informative. Particularly a study in 2003 which reported that of 314 therapists surveyed, 42% said that they commonly dealt with lesbian, gay and bi clients and lesbian, gay and bi issues. 91% of them identified as heterosexual, confirming really that a great many LGB clients, at least, are seeking support from counsellors outside of LGBTIQ plus community. So what it did for me is it underlined that frameworks and supports are needed to help allied practitioners develop cultural fitness in this area of work. So my readings kept linking back to essential tenets of an approach generally referred to as gay affirmative practice approach. Although the term wasn't always specifically identified in literature, there were some key themes that linked some of the work. One article by Carlson and McGeorge, which is at the bottom, the reference is at the bottom of the screen there, it reports on an empirical study that involved 248 masters and doctoral students of counselling. And it finds, as we see on the screen there, students' increased exposure to content on LGB affirmative therapy concepts and opportunities for self-reflection on their own heterosexual biases were associated with greater levels of self-reported competency working with LGB clients. So what I was gradually learning through these and other articles and reports was that most practitioners out there who are supporting LGBTIQ plus, much like our own cohorts within Relationships Australia Queensland, who are largely not identifying as members of community. So they're doing so from a place of allyship rather than lived experience. And I was learning the exposure to affirmative LGBTIQ plus stories and opportunities for self-reflection were particularly important supports for these practitioners if they were going to be effective in their work with these populations. So what I've come to refer to as queer affirmative practice is a framework which I increasingly felt would be an important, if not central, concept for us to work with in our work with these populations, and also with the practitioners that support them. And training and learning development was a big focus for us once we'd actually started delivering work. So let me go on now to talk a bit about what queer affirmative practice is. And what I'll do is I'll just talk through a few slides, and then I'll pause with time for us to have a bit of discussion. Then we'll try and work out the dialogue box so that I can be responding, or if not, we can unmute selectively to have a bit of a conversation. But let me go on first to talk a bit about queer affirmative practice. So these are the three central tenets of a queer affirmative practice approach. So cultural knowledge, there's an availability of all kinds of training around the country now, and in Queensland there's some excellent work from GLWA and QAC, Queensland AIDS Council, that provide training to organisations on the essentials, the basics and the key concepts and theories and ideas, and this is important foundational work. What I'll often say to clinicians is that working clinically through the Rainbow program with, for instance, same-sex couples or same-gender couples, 80% of the work that we do is the same as that work we'd be doing with mainstream populations. But it's that 20% of cultural knowledge that is often incredibly important in building the therapeutic alliance. And what I'd say as a client and as a practitioner is that people kind of know within the first minute or two of sitting with a counsellor whether that counsellor is going to get them, has any kind of idea or understanding of some of the key concepts and constructs that impact on the lives of people of diverse bodies, genders and sexualities. So it's that 20% of cultural knowledge that's really important. So training at that level enables us to understand the impacts, as we allude to here, of heterosexism, cisgenderism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, in order to take a proactive stance of advocacy, as in point 2 there. And in fact, Catherine Crisp, who's one of the key proponents of this area of work, states here, an absence of homophobia is not sufficient to practice affirmatively. And this is a key point, I think, for this model. Rather, affirmative practice requires that practitioners celebrate and validate the identities of gay men and lesbians, and actively work with these clients to confront their internalized homophobia, to develop positive identities as gay and lesbian individuals. You'll find all the literature is focused on binary constructs of sexuality. There's not a lot of stuff around diverse genders or other sexualities. So this is kind of the language that we'll see out there when we read about this model and this approach. So if we really want to have a look at this language that she's using, this can be, I think, a really big ask, because not just for heterosexual people who are raised with perhaps unsympathetic views of non-hetero and non-cis ways of being in the world, but also I think for LGBTIQ plus folk who've been steeped in the same sort of societal narratives, if you like, and struggle with their own internalized homophobias. I'd suggest that it's not possible to truly celebrate queer identities until we've done the significant work of confronting and working through our own phobias and biases, let alone those of our clients. And that became a really important concept for me in the way we developed training and supports for clinicians within RAQ, because we needed to get to that place where we were having very authentic conversations with ourselves and each other before we even sat across from clients who we may be perceived as other to ourselves. So the third central tenet, that awareness of our own sexuality and gender identity, I've kind of touched on it there. It goes beyond a focus on the other. It reminds us that we all have a gender, we all have a sexual identity, and it encourages learners to turn the gaze inwards in order to develop deeper understanding and empathy of our LGBTIQ plus clients. I felt that of the 3 tenets of queer affirmative practice, this was the one that was probably least explored in training. And so I wanted to be sure that our own learning and development work at RAQ gave it serious attention. In our staff learning and development activities, we use a lot of experiential and narrative approaches to encourage our staff to go beneath the stats and the facts and connect with the lives of LGBTIQ plus people in order to, I suppose, develop empathy and a genuinely proactive stance in support of these communities. So what I'd like to do next is introduce you to a couple of these activities, because it'll give you an example, I think, of how we've married a queer affirmative practice approach with the learning and development work within the organization. So one of the activities we do starts by showing this collage, and what I do is I leave it up there for a few seconds and then say to our audience, and I'm I suppose routinely presenting to about 30 to 35 staff quarterly who are new inductees into the organization. And I'll say, well, what do you see? Give me your impressions, give me your ideas. And of course, we're presenting to a non-queer audience largely, and so the sorts of responses that we'll get will be colour, diversity, vibrancy, Australia, those sorts of things. And so then I say to people, well, look, as a person identifying as a member of the LGBTIQ plus community, I look at this and I don't feel I belong here, because there's nobody in this collage that is gay, lesbian, bi, trans, intersex, queer. They're just not there. To which some people will then say, but well, how do you know? And there lies the key distinction, because we don't know. They're simply not visible. There may be lesbian people in these pictures. There may be trans men in these pictures. We just don't know, because they're not visible. And so it's giving people an experiential access into the construct of heterosexism, heteronormativity, cisgenderism, because it's that subtlety of, it's not necessarily an overt exclusion. It's simply the invisibilizing of, and it can be very subtle. So I'll talk to people about the role of the rainbow reps within our organization, and say that in some regional towns, it's often our rainbow rep, our advocate for LGBTIQ mental health and well-being, who is the only person in some social or educational contexts to put LGBTIQ plus on the map, to actually use the language to make it audible, to make it visible. And that for some young people who are particularly isolated, and particularly in regional areas, this can literally be a lifeline. And so we'll talk about the symbol of the rainbow, and you might have seen, I don't know how big your screens are, but I've just added a rainbow sticker to the collage there. And I talk about the impact of adding that image, that symbol, to that existing collage. And of course, it's only a beginning. We know that the rainbow flag and the rainbow symbol is almost a cliche, but it is often very synonymous for many people of LGBTIQ plus, or at least gay and lesbian culture. And that it's very powerful when we put that sticker on the window of a service, because often it reads to people as, this is a safe place. This is a place where I can come and be safe and be understood and accepted. And so we talk about the importance of, if as a local venue, a staff member or a group of staff members decide they want to put that sticker on the glass window that faces out to the public, they have to be very sure before they do that they have a staff meeting, and they present that sticker in the staff meeting, and they have a conversation about what it is, what it means, what they understand from it, and how they feel about it. And they have to make sure that every single staff member agrees and supports putting that up in the window and feels ready and prepared to be able to make that very strong statement. Because of course, if we don't do that work, then we create greater risk. But it's got to go beyond the conversations about the obvious, and you'll see now I add a few more images, because we have to be able to have conversations about those identities that maybe we haven't got our heads around, that are still a bit marginal in mainstream society. We have to talk about trans and gender diversity. We have to talk about the intersections of race and sexuality and gender, and those compounding factors of intersectionality. And then we have to talk about the very often dangerous identities. And you might see, if your screen's big enough at the bottom there, the last image that I've added there is of a same-sex male couple with a baby, a new baby. And so we have a conversation about this, and we talk about marriage equality, and we talk about the different ways that people responded to marriage equality. And I share my own story, because we feel that personal narratives are really key to the way that we deliver this work. And so I share my own lived experience very freely, and I talk about the ambivalence that I felt when the postal vote for marriage equality came down in the affirmative, and my sister phoned me and said to me, "Isn't this amazing?" And she and other friends were clinking champagne glasses and saying, "Wow, what an amazing day." And I felt like a huge disappointment in saying to her, "Look, I'm really sorry, I'm not in that place." There's a couple of things going on for me right now. One of them is that I'm feeling incredibly relieved, because I know how much pressure this has put on our community, and how helpline phones have been ringing off hook for the last month and a half, and people have been put in great risk of mental illness and unwellness. And so I sat there with a great deal of relief that this bit's over. We can start to rebuild and repair and move forward. And I also sat there with a little bit of, I'm not quite sure what this means for me. A great deal of my self-concept has been built around being a marginal person, being someone who's not accepted as part of community. Because when we look at marriage, we see something which is a central symbol and construct within every civilization on earth in some form or another. It's the construct which paves the way for full citizenship into our community, for the creation of the new generation. And whether people opt into it or opt out of it, its history is incredibly strong. And to say to one group of people, you can't be part of this, is incredibly potent. So I was trying to explain to my sister, I'm not quite sure what to do with now being a person who's invited into the very inner sanctum of mainstream community. It feels weird, it feels strange, and it's good. And I'm really happy that people coming after me will have this experience and will be natives to this new balance in society. But for me, as a 50-something person who's lived in this other world for a long time, it just feels a bit strange, and I need to work on that. So we have that conversation because we think it's really important for our trainees to understand the nuanced stories out there, and not to be drawn into binaries and polarities. So we take these pictures away, and we stop having these conversations, and we stop deliberately naming and identifying and visualizing, and we're back to this image. And obviously, for many young people and older people in community, this is a high-risk, dangerous situation. So when we explain the impacts of the various isms and phobias that shape the self-concept of children of emerging queer identities, we tell the story of a child growing up in a regional community where we know that risks are statistically higher, born into heteronormative and cisnormative family, culture and community. We talk about a child who negotiates their place across the various social spheres of home, school, church community, sports team, scouts or guides, the wider local community, and yet sees themselves reflected nowhere, other than in the jokes and jibes that they increasingly perceive as somehow being about them. So we talk about the two essential choices that this child has to make, to either say perhaps, they've all got it wrong. I'm fine. I'm happy being the way I am, and they'll all have to come around. Or on the other side, they can't all be wrong. They must be right, and I must be all these things. So it's important for us when working from this perspective of queer affirmative practice to make these constructs real, and to use story to animate them. So when we talk about heterosexism, I'm sorry about the terrible formatting of the letters on those titles there. That really troubles my OCD aspects of my personality, but we'll just live with it. When we talk about heterosexism, cisgenderism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, these are the things we're talking about, and this is the child that we're talking about. Because it takes a very exceptional child of 11 or 12 or 13 to realize that first option, to say, I'm okay, you've all got it wrong. So invariably, as many of you know, the external slings and arrows, if you like, become internalized, and they form the early building blocks of a child's self-concept of their queerness. So this is the stuff that sees countless queer people spending the next 30 years of their lives trying to unravel, and it's completely preventable. We let there be no doubt when we're speaking to trainees at RAQ that it's literally a lifeline for LGBTIQ youth, and that affirming and celebrating queer identities is an essential health and well-being strategy, not political correctness, as it might be characterized in the dismissals of social conservatives. And this is something which we're hearing increasingly when our voices become stronger and are given greater platforms, is the voices of the social conservatives who say, this is all political correctness gone mad, get louder too. And so it's really important for us to articulate and have our trainees understand what are some of those social constructs and narratives going on in the background, and why it's not political correctness when it really matters to people, young and old. That if we're not the ones to put up our hands and disrupt the dominant narratives, we leave people at risk and isolated. So this is another activity that we conduct in our trainings, and this is one which is quite confronting. And when we're doing it live, we're always very careful to invite people to participate at a level that feels okay for them. And I'll describe it. So we draw an outline on the butcher's paper on the floor of a young person. We suggest that this is the young person we've spoken about in that last slide, and we scatter some colored pens, and we invite people to write down on the outside of the outline all the words, phrases, myths, accusations that might be thrown in a negative way at this child or young person. All those things that come from that place that we saw in the previous slide of heterosexism, cisgenderism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. And people write them all down, and then we stand around the outline and we actually read them out loud, and we invite people around the circle, if they feel comfortable, to join us in actually verbalizing those words. And we feel it's important for people to hear them because this child hears them every week and maybe every day. And so to do that together and to hear those words together gives us an approximation. It gives us an experiential glimpse at some of the weight that might sit there for that person. Once we've done that, I invite people to either step into the shoes of that child or young person, or if that feels too confronting, take a bit of emotional distance, step in their own shoes, but imagine what it might feel like for that young person to receive all those words, And after about 30 seconds of just quiet reflection, I invite people to take up the pens again and to write those feelings on the inside of the outline. And then we read those words out as well, and we reflect on that. And then we have a bit of conversation. We leave lots of space for reflection and conversation in all our activities. And then we play a video narrative of a young person going through just this sort of experience. And it's a video narrative with a happy ending from a young person who did survive, unlike those that don't, and did go on to be able to reach across and come out to someone who was then supportive, that helped them to build towards a more positive self-concept and self-esteem. So when we talk about the coming out journey, we do introduce participants to the Vivian Cass model that many of you are familiar with. It remains the most referred to model for explaining the key experiential stages of self-actualization for a queer person. And we also talk about the different perspectives of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, of people coming out later in life, of those who'll never choose to come out for fear and shame. And we talk about the nuanced experience of every sexually diverse person who, by the very nature of heteronormativity, is having to decide whether or not to out themselves by correcting or not correcting the heteronormative assumption, the pronoun of their partner, that sort of thing, every day, or as I say, every week. And for those who thought that the coming out experience is a singular watershed moment in the life of an LGBTIQ plus person, we need people to understand that this experience is not just historical. It's continuous and ongoing, and will be as long as heterosexism and cisgenderism prevail. We play a little game as well there, where we get people in pairs, and it kind of lightens the mood a bit. We invite people in pairs to spend a minute each way introducing themselves to the other, and they're to share as much as they possibly can in the 1 minute that they're comfortable sharing, but they can't give away their sexual orientation. They can't even imply or say anything that might indicate their sexual orientation. And so it's a bit of fun, and it's a kind of a quick activity, but it's quite interesting because people get themselves tied up in all kinds of linguistic conundrums, trying to work out what to say and what to kind of annex out and not talk about, and then what that feels like to take their partner and edit them from their story, and if they don't do that, what does it feel like to have to negotiate linguistically and take out pronouns so that they don't give away the gender of their partner. And so we do that for 2 minutes. Then we get people to feedback, and they often talk about the sorts of discomforts that many people who genuinely have lived significantly in the closet, as most of us LGBTIQ people have for some period, even if it was between age 14 and 16. We've all spent a significant period playing those linguistic games and trying to negotiate the conversations, and often that's meant that we've been removed, or our relationships with friends or family have distanced or stayed at a certain level. And we talk about that, and people get that little experiential glimpse into what that might be like. For some it's difficult, for some it just becomes the way that we do things, and so it's not difficult at all. So I'm going to stop talking in a minute and see if we can find some interesting ways to have a bit of a dialogue. But just to summarize a little bit, really, the gay affirmative practice, or queer affirmative practice approach, as I refer to it, it doesn't provide a fully fledged approach to clinical work with LGBTIQ plus population. So in a sense, or in a strict sense, it's not a model, but more a broad approach. And you'll see this echoed in the critiques of some of the reports. So the references I provided here might be useful reading for those wanting to learn more. So I'll leave this up perhaps as we open things up for a bit of a discussion. And so now I just really invite your thoughts, your reflections, your feelings, your ideas, your own experiences in relation to this kind of approach. And hopefully Charlie's still with us, so they might be able to help me work out. Hello, Charlie, you're there.
Hello, I am here. I'm just hoping that folks are able to click on the chat at the bottom of the screen. If you should be able, that should bring up a text box. And if that's okay, I'll send a message to everyone in case to check that you can receive.
So I'll minimize and then go to, hello. That didn't work very well.
Otherwise, if people did want to unmute, if they had any reflections for Chris after what he's just gone through with us here today. So I've got a question here, Chris,
Cool.
from Nick. First, thanking you, but do you have any advice on end of life or palliative care considerations?
It's a good question. I think I feel like I want to hear more in what you mean. Can you say more, Nick?
Nick's involved in policy in this area.
So when you talk about end of life or palliative care and in relation to queer affirmative practice, I suppose where my mind goes is it's really to awareness and training of those working in hospices or working in institutions supporting people at that end stage of their life, to really understand that people need to end life with dignity, just as we hope they can live life with dignity. So it's really about continuing the education so that people who are working so closely and intimately with people at that stage in their life have the language and have the constructs and have the understanding to not necessarily know everything, but at least show somebody that they're open and they're ready and they have enough cultural competence to be able to be part of those conversations. So I think it's obviously a very vulnerable stage of life, and people need to feel that they can speak openly and be completely authentic at that stage in their life. I speak from having worked in an HIV and AIDS hospice in the 80s, and knowing how very important it is for people to be able to be authentic at that time. Most of our staff in that hospice were LGBTIQ, and so that really supported people. But where that's not always the case, people need to be supported in developing the cultural competence to be able to have those conversations with people. I don't know if that answers your question. That would be my response.
Thanks for that, Chris. I've got another question here from Katie. Have you had an opportunity to evaluate the program, and has there been a positive change? Is it delivering the desired outcomes?
Yeah, really good question. We've only really just started to evaluate properly. I mean, we've evaluated all our training we've done over the last 5 years, and so it's all self-reporting. It's not a rigorous research approach. So we ask people, we do a pre and post, and we ask people about their knowledge, awareness, understandings at the beginning of a session, and then we ask them the same questions at the end. And what we find in that kind of approach, which isn't the most rigorous, but it does give us some indication, is that people almost always feel that they know more, understand more, and sometimes feel more confident and competent, but not always. People always speak to their increase in understanding and knowledge, and people will often come into our training saying, we're spending 6 hours talking about queer stuff. What are we going to do once we've just spent the first 2 hours learning the words? What do we do for the rest of the day? And then they leave the day saying, wow, I didn't actually realize there's so much. So sometimes people are saying, people are almost always saying, I've learned a lot, I know so much more that I'm going to be able to apply to my practice, but they're not always saying, I feel more competent and confident. Sometimes they're saying, wow, there was so much I don't know, I've really got to go away and do some extra work. So some of that longitudinal stuff we still have yet to do.
Thanks, Chris. We've got another question here from Linda. Is the training only available to counsellors or psychologists, or to wider health professionals? So
this is a training that we roll out for all of our employees here at RAQ. So everyone, whether they're administration officers or managers or clinicians or research officers, they all attend this mandatory training. We used to deliver this externally, but because of capacity at the moment, we're not doing that. But we hope that we'll be able to regroup and offer this training back out to the sector possibly next year. But that's in a bit of a hiatus at the moment. But we feel that it's important that everybody has these conversations. We do broader work around cultural competence of those other cohorts and communities as well now, and we spend an intensive 2 days. So our organisation has been very generous in giving us 2 whole days that people come away from their core work to do cultural competence training, if you like, cultural fitness training we call it. And we think it's important that everybody in the organisation is part of the conversation, not just the clinicians, because it's part of cultural change in this organisation and we all need to be on board.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Does anyone else have any questions or reflections from today's webinar? Using the chat option down the bottom. I think that's been a really great presentation, Chris. I think the activity you do with the outline of the body is quite powerful and it'd be a bit confronting for some folk that haven't thought about that or considered that. So, and through the chat, we're getting lots of encouragement for that work. So thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks for checking in, everyone, and thanks, Charlie, for facilitating that. It's always really nice to have conversations about this and hear your questions, because it gives me a chance to re-articulate what we do and why we do it. So thanks for the opportunity.
Great. And thank you everyone for jumping on the webinar today. This was recorded and will be available on our website as well. And thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time today. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks a lot, folks.